I married a monster to save my father, or so I believed. What fell to the floor on my wedding night was not the man I feared, but every lie I had been told about love. My name is Rosalind Whitmore, and I was born into the peculiar purgatory of those who are neither wealthy nor destitute, but who exist in that fragile space between respectability and ruin. My father, Edmund Whitmore, had once been a merchant of modest success, trading in silks and fine linens that traveled from the ports of Bristol to the drawing rooms of London. He had built his business with careful hands and a keen eye for quality, earning the respect of clients and competitors alike. My mother had been his greatest treasure, a woman of gentle beauty and quiet wisdom who filled our home with music and laughter and the scent of the lavender she grew in our small garden. She died when I was 17, taken by a fever that swept through our parish one bitter February. I remember the way the world seemed to lose its color in those terrible days, how the snow that fell outside our windows looked gray rather than white, how food lost its taste and sleep became a stranger. I sat by her bedside through those final hours, holding her hand as it grew cold, listening to the ragged rhythm of her breathing slow and finally cease. When she left us, she took something vital from my father with her, some essential spark that had animated his spirit and given purpose to his days. Grief, I learned in the months and years that followed, is a thief that takes more than the person you mourn. It takes pieces of those who remain. My father, once so vibrant and capable, seemed to shrink before my eyes. He made poor decisions in his business, trusted men who did not deserve his trust, invested in ventures that promised much and delivered nothing. By the time I was 23, our fortune had dwindled to almost nothing. The fine house of my childhood was sold to pay creditors. The servants who had been like family were dismissed with tearful farewells and whatever references I could provide. We were left with little more than the clothes we wore and the small cottage we rented on the edge of the village, a humble dwelling with a leaking roof and drafts that crept through the walls like unwelcome guests. It was then that I made a decision that would alter the course of my life forever. I would seek employment as a servant. The irony was not lost on me. I, who had once been served, would now serve others. But there was no shame in honest work, my mother had taught me that, and I would do whatever was necessary to keep my father housed and fed. The alternative, the workhouse or the charity of strangers who had once envied our prosperity, was unthinkable. The position I secured was at Halford House, a grand estate owned by the elderly Lord and Lady Halford, whose kindness was spoken of throughout the county. They were childless, having lost their only son to illness many years before, and they ran their household with a gentle hand that made service there bearable, even pleasant at times. I was to be a chambermaid, responsible for the upkeep of the guest rooms and the polishing of silver that gleamed like captured moonlight. It was honest work, and though my hands grew rough and my back often ached from hours of scrubbing and lifting, I found a certain peace in the rhythm of service. There is dignity in labor, my mother used to say. She had said it when teaching me to mend my own stockings, when showing me how to bake bread, when explaining that every person, regardless of station, deserved respect for the work they did. I clung to her words like a talisman in those early days at Halford House, repeating them to myself when the other servants whispered about my fallen circumstances, when guests looked through me as though I were invisible, when the ache of my former life threatened to overwhelm me. For 2 years, I worked at Halford House, sending what little I could spare back to my father. He wrote to me occasionally, brief letters that spoke of the weather and the garden and the meals he prepared for himself, never mentioning the shadows I knew lurked behind his words. I worried about him constantly, imagining him alone in that drafty cottage with only memories for company. But I could not leave my position. The small wage I earned was all that stood between us and utter destitution. I learned the invisible art of servitude during those years. I learned how to move through rooms as though I were made of shadow and silence, anticipating the needs of my betters before they spoke them aloud. I learned which floorboards creaked and which doors required a gentle touch to close without sound. I learned to keep my eyes lowered and my opinions unspoken, though there were times when both threatened to betray me. I learned to be present without being noticed, useful without being seen, essential without being acknowledged. It was a strange existence, this life between worlds. I was too educated for the other servants, my accent and manners marking me as different. Yet I was a servant nonetheless, subject to the same long hours and modest accommodations. The housekeeper, Mrs. Clement, was kind to me in her gruff way, recognizing perhaps something of her own history in my circumstances. She assigned me the better tasks when she could, the work that was less backbreaking, less demeaning. She saved me extra portions at meals when the cook was not watching. She never spoke of her kindness, and I never acknowledged it directly. But an understanding grew between us that made my days more bearable. It was during my second autumn at Halford House that I first heard the name that would come to define my destiny: the Duke of Ravensmoor. He was spoken of in whispers among the other servants, a figure of mystery and speculation that seemed almost mythical in the retelling. The footman claimed he was enormously fat, so large that he required specially made furniture and could barely walk without assistance. The kitchen maids whispered that he never attended balls or social gatherings, preferring the solitude of his vast estate some 30 miles to the north. The older servants remembered when he had been different, when he had been a young man who danced at every ball and charmed every lady. But something had changed him, transformed him into the recluse he now was. Some said he was cruel, a tyrant who treated his servants harshly and his tenants worse. Others suggested he was merely cold, a man whose heart had turned to stone from some disappointment or tragedy. A few claimed he had been disappointed in love, jilted by a woman who had wounded him so deeply that he had retreated from the world entirely. The stories varied with each telling, growing more elaborate and more fantastical as they passed from one person to another. I paid little attention to such gossip. The affairs of dukes were as distant from my life as the stars that glittered above the servants' quarters on clear nights. I had my own concerns, my own quiet hopes and fears that filled the hours between waking and sleeping. I thought of my father often, wondering if he had enough coal for the fire, if he remembered to eat the bread I had arranged to be delivered each week, if the loneliness was slowly consuming what remained of his spirit. I thought of the future, that uncertain landscape that stretched before me like an uncharted sea, and I wondered what would become of me when I was too old to scrub floors and polish silver. I did not think of dukes, but fate, I would learn, cares nothing for what we think or do not think. It moves according to its own mysterious design, weaving threads we cannot see until the pattern is already complete. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late November, when the first frost had painted the windows of Halford House with delicate crystals of ice. I had been working since before dawn, helping to prepare the guest rooms for a party of visitors expected later that week. My arms ached from beating carpets, and my knees were sore from kneeling on hard floors. I was thinking of nothing more than the cup of tea that awaited me in the servants' hall when one of the footmen found me and told me I had been summoned. "Lady Halford wishes to see you," he said, and there was something in his expression, a flicker of curiosity or perhaps pity, that made my stomach tighten with apprehension. In her private sitting room. I followed him through the corridors of the great house, past the portraits and tapestries I knew so well, past the rooms I had cleaned 1,000 times. My heart had begun to race before I even reached the door of Lady Halford's sitting room. Servants were not summoned to such places for pleasant reasons. Something had happened. Something was wrong. Lady Halford was seated by the fire, her silver hair swept beneath a cap of fine lace, her expression grave. She was a small woman, made smaller by age, but her eyes were sharp and her mind sharper still. She had always treated me with a kindness that went beyond what my position warranted, and I had sometimes wondered if she saw in me a reflection of the daughter she had never had. "Rosalind," she said as I entered, and the gentleness in her voice frightened me more than anger would have. "Please sit down." I sat on the edge of a chair, My hands folded tightly in my lap to stop them from trembling. The fire crackled in the grate, the only sound in the room besides my own unsteady breathing. Lady Halford studied me for a long moment before speaking again. Her eyes, the pale blue of a winter sky, held an expression I could not quite read. "I have received some distressing news concerning your father," she said at last. "It seems he has incurred a substantial debt, a debt of £50,000. The number struck me like a physical blow. £50,000. It was an impossible sum, more money than I could earn in 100 lifetimes of service. It was more than Halford House itself was worth, more than the entire village, more than anything I could conceive of. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My mind had gone blank, unable to process what I was hearing. "The debt is owed to the Duke of Ravensmoor," Lady Halford continued, her voice calm and measured, as though she were delivering news about the weather rather than the destruction of everything I held dear. "Your father borrowed the money some months ago, believing he could repay it through a business venture that has since failed spectacularly. The Duke has every legal right to have him imprisoned." Prison. The word echoed in my mind like a death knell, like the tolling of a church bell for the dead. I thought of my father, already so fragile, so diminished by loss and disappointment and years of struggle. I thought of his gentle hands that had once counted coins so carefully, his kind eyes that had grown dim with sorrow. Prison would kill him. I was as certain of that as I was of anything in the world. "I do not understand," I finally managed to say, my voice emerging as little more than a whisper. "Why would the Duke lend such a sum to my father? They cannot possibly know each other. My father has never spoken of knowing a duke." Lady Halford's expression grew even more troubled. She reached for a cup of tea on the table beside her, but did not drink from it, merely held it as though drawing warmth from the porcelain. "It seems they were acquainted many years ago, before your father's circumstances changed," she explained. "The Duke apparently offered the loan as a gesture of goodwill toward an old acquaintance, though I confess I do not fully understand the nature of their connection. Your father told me very little when he came to me seeking advice." "My father came to you?" I asked, surprise momentarily cutting through my fear. "He did," Lady Halford confirmed. "He was desperate, Rosalind. He begged me to help him find some solution, some way to repay the debt. But £50,000. She shook her head slowly. "There is nothing I can do. Even if I were to sell everything I own, I could not raise such a sum." I sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend how my life had shifted so dramatically in the span of a few sentences. My father had never mentioned knowing a duke. He had never spoken of any connection to the aristocracy. What secrets had he kept from me? What desperate gamble had led him to borrow such an impossible amount? "There is more," Lady Halford said, and something in her tone made me look up sharply, my attention suddenly focused with painful intensity. "The Duke has sent word that he is willing to forgive the entire debt, all £50,000. Hope flickered in my chest, fragile and uncertain as a candle flame in a drafty room. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything would be all right, that some miracle had occurred, that my father would be saved. "But why?" I asked. "What does he want in return?" Lady Halford did not answer immediately. She rose from her chair with the careful movements of age and walked to the window, gazing out at the frost-covered gardens. The gray November light fell across her face, illuminating the lines that time had carved there, the shadows beneath her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He wants you, Rosalind. He wants you to become his wife." I cannot adequately describe what I felt in that moment. Shock, certainly. Disbelief so profound it bordered on absurdity. A strange, cold horror that seemed to freeze the very blood in my veins and turn my limbs to stone. I had never met the Duke of Ravensmoor. I had never even seen his face, except in my imagination, where it had taken the form of something monstrous, shaped by the whispered stories of servants and the dark corners of nightmare. And yet he wanted to marry me, a chambermaid with rough hands and a borrowed dress, in exchange for my father's freedom. "I do not understand," I said again, and the words felt hollow, insufficient to contain the enormity of what I was being asked to comprehend. Why me? Why would a duke want to marry a servant? Lady Halford turned to face me, and I saw something in her eyes that looked almost like pity, like the sorrow of a mother watching her daughter walk toward inevitable pain. "Nor do I understand entirely," she admitted, "but the offer is genuine. I have verified it myself through every channel available to me. If you agree to marry the Duke, your father's debt will be erased entirely. He will be free. He will be safe. And if I refuse?" The words hung in the air between us, heavy with consequence. "Then your father will be arrested within the fortnight," Lady Halford said quietly. "The Duke has made that quite clear. He will be taken to debtor's prison, and he will remain there until the debt is paid, which, given the circumstances, means he will remain there until he dies." I closed my eyes and saw my father's face as it had looked the last time I visited him, thin and pale and marked by years of grief. I saw the tremor in his hands as he poured tea, the forced cheerfulness of his smile as he assured me he was well. I saw the cottage where he lived alone, with its peeling wallpaper and sagging floors, and the garden my mother had planted that he still tended despite everything. I could not let him go to prison. I could not let him die alone in some cold cell, surrounded by strangers, paying for a debt he had incurred in a moment of desperate hope. He was my father. He had given me life, had loved me as best he could despite his flaws and failures. Whatever the cost, I had to save him. I sat in that elegant room with its silk wallpaper and crackling fire, and I felt the walls of my small, careful life closing in around me. I thought of all the things I had dreamed of during the lonely nights in the servants' quarters, the modest hopes I had nurtured in secret. A cottage of my own someday, perhaps. A husband who might love me, or at least treat me with kindness. A life that was mine to shape, however humble it might be. Children to raise and love, to teach all the things my mother had taught me. All of those dreams turned to ash in an instant, scattered by the wind of circumstance. "I will do it," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, as though it belonged to someone else entirely, to a woman braver and more resigned than I felt myself to be. "I will marry him." Lady Halford crossed the room and took my hands in hers. They were warm, soft with age, and the gentleness of a life spent caring for others. "Are you certain?" she asked, her eyes searching my face for any sign of doubt. "This is not a decision to be made lightly, Rosalind. Marriage is forever. You do not know this man. You do not know what kind of husband he will be." "I am certain," I told her, though I was certain of nothing except that I could not let my father suffer for my sake. "I am certain that I must do this." She was silent for a long moment, still holding my hands, still searching my face. Then she sighed, a sound of such profound sadness that it made my eyes sting with unshed tears. "You are a brave woman," she said softly, "braver than you know. I pray that this choice brings you more happiness than sorrow." The arrangements were made with a swiftness that left me breathless, as though the Duke, whoever he was, feared I might change my mind if given too much time to think. Within a week, I had packed my few belongings into a worn carpet bag and bid farewell to Halford House, to the other servants who had become something like family, to the rhythm of days that had grown familiar and almost comfortable. Mrs. Clement embraced me before I left, a fierce, tight embrace that said everything she could not put into words. "You take care of yourself," she said gruffly when she finally released me. "And if that Duke gives you any trouble, you write to me, you hear? I will come up there myself and give him a piece of my mind." I laughed despite myself, despite the tears that threatened to spill down my cheeks. "I will," I promised. Lady Halford pressed a small purse of coins into my hand as I departed, along with a whispered blessing that I carried with me like a prayer. She also gave me a letter of introduction, written in her own hand, attesting to my character and worth. "Use it if you ever need it," she said. "Remember that you have friends here. You are not alone." The journey to Ravensmoor Hall took most of a day. I traveled by hired carriage, a simple conveyance that rattled and swayed over roads that grew progressively worse as we moved north. I watched through the window as the landscape changed from the gentle farmland I knew to wilder, more rugged terrain. The fields gave way to moors, vast expanses of heath and scrub that stretched to the horizon like a sea of brown and purple. The trees grew sparse and twisted, bent by winds that never ceased. The sky grew heavy with clouds, and by the time we reached the estate, a light rain had begun to fall, turning the world gray and indistinct. My first glimpse of Ravensmoor Hall took my breath away, though not in the manner I had expected. It was vast, certainly, a sprawling edifice of dark stone that seemed to rise from the earth like a natural formation rather than something built by human hands. Towers reached toward the stormy sky, their windows glinting like watchful eyes. Battlements crowned the walls, remnants of a more violent age when lords had needed such fortifications against enemies real and imagined. The grounds were extensive, acres of parkland and gardens that must have been magnificent in summer, but now lay dormant beneath the gray November sky. There was beauty in it, I realized as the carriage drew closer. A severe and melancholy grandeur that spoke of centuries of history, of lives lived and lost within those ancient walls, of stories I could not imagine and secrets I might never learn. It was not a welcoming place, not warm or inviting, but it commanded a certain awe nonetheless. The carriage stopped before the main entrance, where a set of stone steps led up to massive oak doors. A servant hurried forward with an umbrella to shield me from the rain, and I was ushered inside with an efficiency that suggested my arrival had been anticipated, perhaps even eagerly awaited. The entrance hall was enormous, dominated by a sweeping staircase that curved upward like a frozen wave. Candles flickered in elaborate sconces along the walls, casting dancing shadows that gave the space a dreamlike quality. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down at me from their gilded frames, men and women in elaborate clothing from centuries past, their expressions uniformly grave. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystal pendants catching the candlelight and scattering it in prisms of color. I stood there in my simple traveling dress, my carpet bag clutched in my hands, and I felt suddenly, acutely aware of my own insignificance. I was a maid, a nobody, about to marry into a lineage that stretched back centuries into a world of wealth and privilege that I could barely comprehend. The absurdity of it threatened to overwhelm me. "Miss Whitmore," a voice said, and I turned to find an elderly woman approaching. She was dressed in black, her silver hair pulled back in a severe style that emphasized the sharp bones of her face. But her eyes were not unkind. There was warmth in them, and curiosity, and something that might have been sympathy. "I am Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper," she continued. "I will show you to your rooms. His Grace has asked me to ensure you have everything you need." I followed her up the grand staircase and through a maze of corridors, each more lavish than the last. Paintings lined the walls, depicting landscapes and hunting scenes and portraits of women in elaborate gowns. The floors were covered with carpets so thick and soft that my footsteps made no sound. Everything smelled of beeswax and old wood and something else, something I could not identify. Perhaps it was simply the scent of wealth, of a world so far removed from my own that it might as well have been another country. My rooms, as Mrs. Pemberton called them, consisted of a sitting area, a bedchamber, and a small dressing room. The furnishings were elegant, but not ostentatious, done in shades of blue and cream that reminded me of summer skies and clouds reflected in still water. A fire had already been lit in the grate, crackling cheerfully against the chill of the November evening. Fresh flowers sat on a table by the window, their sweet scent filling the air. "The wedding will take place tomorrow afternoon," Mrs. Pemberton informed me as I stood in the center of the room, trying to absorb everything I was seeing. "His Grace thought you might prefer a quiet ceremony, given the circumstances." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Tomorrow." I would be married tomorrow, to a man I had never seen in a place I did not know. Mrs. Pemberton seemed to sense my distress. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame, and studied me with those shrewd, kind eyes. "He is not what they say," she said quietly, her voice soft enough that no one passing in the corridor could overhear. "The Duke. I have served this household for 30 years, since I was a young woman myself. I know him as well as anyone in this world, perhaps better than most. He is not cruel. He is not monstrous. Remember that, whatever else you may hear or believe." "Then why does he hide?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. "Why does everyone speak of him as though he were some kind of monster?" Mrs. Pemberton's expression flickered with something I could not read. Sorrow, perhaps, or regret, or the weight of secrets kept too long. "That is not my story to tell," she said. "But perhaps in time, he will tell it himself. Give him a chance, Miss Whitmore. That is all I ask. Give him a chance." She left me then, alone with my thoughts and my fears and the soft crackle of the fire. I walked to the window and looked out at the grounds of Ravensmoor Hall, shrouded in mist and rain. Somewhere in this vast house, the Duke was waiting. My future husband, my stranger. I wondered what kind of man would propose marriage to a woman he had never met. I wondered what he wanted from me, what expectations he held that I would be required to fulfill. I wondered if I would ever feel anything for him beyond obligation and fear, or if my life would now be one of duty without affection, service without love. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, surrounded by unfamiliar shadows, listening to the rain against the windows and the distant creaking of the old house settling around me. The fire cast strange shapes on the walls, and I found myself imagining faces in them, faces that watched me with unknown intentions. I thought of my father, safe now from prison, free from the debt that had threatened to destroy him. I imagined him in his cottage, perhaps unaware yet of the sacrifice I had made, perhaps sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. I told myself that whatever happened, whatever sacrifices I was called upon to make, it would be worth it. He was safe. That was what mattered. That had to be what mattered. But in the dark hours before dawn, when the fire had died to embers and the rain had finally ceased, I allowed myself a moment of weakness. I pressed my face into the pillow and wept, mourning the life I would never have, the love I would never know. I wept for the girl I had been, innocent and hopeful despite everything, and the woman I would be forced to become. I wept until there were no tears left, until my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw. And then I rose, washed my face in the basin of cold water that had been left for me, and prepared to meet my fate. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Servants came and went, bringing breakfast I could not eat, hot water for bathing, and finally the wedding gown that had been commissioned for me. It was a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk, with a high waist and long sleeves and a modest train that whispered against the floor when I walked. Someone had thought of everything, including the delicate pearl earrings that were pressed into my hand and the bouquet of white roses that waited on a table by the door. A maid I had never seen before arranged my hair, pinning it up in a style far more elaborate than anything I had ever worn. Her hands were deft and gentle, and she worked in silence, her eyes focused on her task. When she was finished, she stepped back and nodded with satisfaction. "You look beautiful, miss," she said simply. "The Duke will be pleased." I turned to look at myself in the mirror and did not recognize the woman who stared back. She looked like a duchess. This stranger in ivory silk, with her hair swept up and pearls glinting at her ears. She looked like she belonged in this grand house amid these grand people. She looked nothing like the chambermaid who had scrubbed floors and polished silver at Halford House. But her eyes were the same. My eyes, haunted and uncertain, filled with a fear that no fine dress could disguise. The wedding was everything Mrs. Pemberton had promised. Quiet, almost unbearably so. It took place in the private chapel attached to Ravensmoor Hall, a small but exquisite space with stained glass windows that cast colored light across the stone floor. The pews were empty except for a handful of servants who had been summoned to serve as witnesses, their faces carefully blank as they watched me walk down the narrow aisle. I wore the ivory gown and carried the white roses, and I felt like an actress in a play whose script I had never been shown. Each step brought me closer to the altar, to the man who waited there, to the destiny I had not chosen but could not escape. I remember the way my heart hammered in my chest as I approached, so loudly that I was certain everyone in the chapel could hear it. I remember the smell of candle wax and old incense, the way the colored light fell across the pews in patterns of red and gold and blue. I remember the cold of the stone floor seeping through the thin soles of my shoes, and the way my hands trembled as they clutched the bouquet of roses. And I remember my first sight of him. He was standing at the altar with his back to me, and I could see the breadth of his shoulders beneath his dark coat, the sheer physical mass of him. The rumors had not exaggerated his size. He was enormous, a mountain of a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire chapel. When he turned to face me, I had to fight to keep my expression neutral, to hide the shock that must have shone in my eyes. His face was round and fleshy, his features almost obscured by the heaviness of his cheeks and jowls. He wore a cravat tied high around his neck, white against the somber black of his coat, and his hands were gloved in pristine white. Everything about him suggested bulk, weight, a physical presence that was almost overwhelming. But his eyes were something else entirely. They were gray, the color of storm clouds over the sea, and they held an intensity that seemed almost at odds with the rest of his appearance. He looked at me with an expression I could not read, something between assessment and something softer, something that might have been hope. There was intelligence in those eyes, and depth, and a wariness that mirrored my own. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was deep and measured, with a quality of restraint that suggested he was accustomed to guarding his words carefully. "Thank you for coming." It seemed a strange thing to say, as though I had arrived for a social call rather than a wedding I had been coerced into accepting. But I simply nodded, unable to find words, and took my place beside him at the altar. The ceremony began. I remember little of the vows themselves. The words passed over me like water, sounds without meaning that I repeated when prompted. The minister spoke of love and honor and obedience, of duties and privileges and sacred bonds, and I wondered if he knew how hollow those words sounded to a bride who had been purchased for the price of a debt. I remember the weight of the ring as it was placed on my finger, a simple gold band that felt like a shackle and a promise at once. I remember the moment when the minister pronounced us man and wife, and the hollow silence that followed, broken only by the soft rustle of the servants shifting in their pews. The Duke did not kiss me. He merely offered his arm, and I took it, and together we walked out of the chapel as husband and wife. The arm beneath my hand was solid, warm even through the layers of his coat, and I could feel the tension in his muscles, a rigidity that suggested he was as nervous as I was. We emerged from the chapel into a corridor that led back to the main house. The candles had been lit against the gray November afternoon, and their warm glow cast soft shadows on the walls. "You must be hungry," the Duke said, his voice breaking the silence that had stretched between us. "I have asked the staff to prepare a wedding breakfast. I hope it will be to your taste." "Thank you," I managed, my voice sounding small and strange in the vast corridor. "That is very kind." He glanced at me, a quick, assessing look that I did not understand. "You need not be afraid of me," he said quietly. I know the circumstances of our marriage are unusual. But I mean you no harm, Rosalind. You have my word on that." It was the first time he had used my given name, and the sound of it on his lips did something strange to my heart. Not affection, not yet, but something like recognition, an acknowledgement that I was a person to him, not merely a transaction. "Thank you," I said again, and this time the words carried more weight. The wedding breakfast was a subdued affair, just the two of us seated at opposite ends of a long dining table, served by silent footmen who moved with practiced efficiency. The food was excellent, course after course of delicacies I had only heard of, never tasted, but I picked at it without appetite, too aware of the man across from me, too conscious of what the evening would bring. The wedding night. The thought filled me with a dread I could not entirely conceal. The Duke, for his part, seemed content with silence. He ate steadily, his attention focused on his plate, occasionally glancing in my direction, but making no attempt at conversation. I studied him when I thought he was not looking, trying to reconcile the monster of rumor with the man before me. He moved with surprising grace for someone of his size, his hands deft and careful as he handled his knife and fork. There was something almost deliberate about his movements, as though each gesture had been considered in advance. His face was difficult to read, the heaviness of his features masking whatever emotions might lurk beneath. Only his eyes betrayed any feeling, and those were guarded, watchful, giving nothing away. When the meal finally ended, he rose from his chair and walked the length of the table to stand beside me. His shadow fell across my plate, and I looked up to find those gray eyes regarding me with an expression that defied interpretation. "You must be tired," he said. "It has been a long day. I will have Mrs. Pemberton show you to your chambers." I blinked, uncertain what to say. I had expected. I did not know what I had expected. Demands, perhaps. Assertions of marital rights. The wedding night claims that every wife was obligated to satisfy. Instead, he was offering me solitude, a reprieve from the fate I had been dreading. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "You are very kind." He nodded once, his expression still unreadable, then hesitated as though there was something more he wished to say. But the moment passed, and he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the remnants of our wedding breakfast and a confusion that bordered on disorientation. Mrs. Pemberton appeared moments later to escort me to my chambers. They were different from the rooms I had occupied the night before, larger and more opulent, clearly the quarters of the Duchess of Ravensmoor. The bed was enormous, draped in silk the color of midnight, and a fire burned brightly in the marble fireplace. Paintings adorned the walls, landscapes of the moors surrounding the estate, and the furniture was dark wood polished to a gleaming shine. Through a connecting door, I could see another room, darker and more masculine in its decor. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, and bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes whose spines glinted with gold lettering. "The Duke's chambers," Mrs. Pemberton said, following my gaze. "He asked me to tell you that he will not disturb you this evening. He thought you might need time to adjust." I stared at the door, trying to understand. This was not how wedding nights were supposed to proceed. Even I, sheltered as I had been, knew that much. A husband had rights, a wife had duties. Laws and customs and centuries of tradition had established the expectations that governed such matters. And yet the Duke, this strange, mysterious man I had married, was offering me neither demands nor expectations. "Is he always like this?" I asked, turning to face Mrs. Pemberton. "So, reserved?" She considered the question for a moment before answering, her expression thoughtful. "His Grace is a complicated man," she said carefully. "He has his reasons for the way he conducts himself. In time, I believe you will come to understand them. But for now, know that he is not cruel. Whatever else you may think of him, he is not cruel." She helped me out of my wedding gown and into a nightdress of fine white cotton, then withdrew with a curtsy and a murmured good night. I was left alone in that grand room, surrounded by luxury I had never imagined, married to a man I did not know. I should have felt relieved. The Duke had given me space, had respected my obvious discomfort, and asked nothing of me. But instead of relief, I felt something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or the first stirrings of a question that would come to dominate my thoughts in the days ahead. Who was this man, really? What secrets did he carry behind those storm-gray eyes? I walked to the connecting door and pressed my palm flat against the wood. It was cool beneath my touch, solid and unyielding. Somewhere beyond it, my husband was preparing for bed, alone as I was alone. I wondered what he was thinking. I wondered if he was as confused as I was, as uncertain about what the future might hold. I wondered if he was as lonely. Sleep eluded me once again that night. I lay in the enormous bed, staring up at the canopy above me, listening to the silence of the house. The fire crackled softly in the grate, and somewhere in the distance an owl called, a mournful sound that seemed to echo my own desolation. At some point, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my door, a heavy tread that paused briefly before continuing on. The Duke, perhaps, passing by on his way to his own chambers. I held my breath until the footsteps faded, then released it in a long, slow exhale. Hours passed. The fire burned low and then lower still, casting dancing shadows across the walls. I must have dozed at some point, because when I next opened my eyes, the quality of the darkness had changed. It was deeper now, more complete, the kind of darkness that comes only in the dead of night, when even the moon has set. And there was a sound. At first I thought I had imagined it, some remnant of a dream I could not recall. But it came again, a soft thud from somewhere nearby, followed by a muffled curse. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and stared at the connecting door to the Duke's chambers. A strip of light showed beneath it now, flickering like candlelight. And as I watched, I heard another sound, a groan of effort, as though someone were struggling with something heavy. I should have stayed in bed. I should have pulled the covers over my head and pretended I had heard nothing. But curiosity, that dangerous impulse that has led so many to ruin, proved stronger than fear. I slipped out of bed and crossed the room on silent feet, my nightdress whispering against my legs. The door was not locked. I turned the handle slowly, carefully, and pushed it open just enough to peer through the gap. What I saw stopped my breath in my throat. The Duke was standing in the center of his chamber, his back to me, his coat already removed and draped over a chair. As I watched, he reached up and began to unfasten his waistcoat, his movements slow and methodical. And then, with a grunt of effort, he pulled something away from his torso and let it fall to the floor. It was padding. Thick, heavy padding, the kind used to stuff cushions or mattresses. It hit the carpet with a soft thump, and then another piece followed, and another. The Duke continued to remove layer after layer, revealing more padding strapped around his middle, his chest, his arms. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. It was as though I were watching a magic trick in reverse, a great illusion being undone before my very eyes. The Duke's massive form was shrinking, diminishing with each piece of padding he removed, until finally, he stood in only his shirt and trousers. And he was not fat at all. He was lean, tall and lean, with broad shoulders that tapered to a narrow waist, his figure as far from the corpulent image he presented to the world as it was possible to be. He rolled his shoulders as though relieving them of a great weight, then ran a hand through his hair, dark hair that I now noticed was thick and slightly wavy, with touches of silver at the temples. I must have made some sound, some involuntary gasp of shock or disbelief, because he turned suddenly, his eyes finding the gap in the door where I stood watching. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The air between us seemed to crackle with tension, with the weight of secrets revealed and assumptions shattered. Then he said very quietly, "I suppose you were bound to discover the truth eventually. I had simply hoped for more time." I pushed the door open fully and stepped into his chamber, my bare feet soundless on the thick carpet. In the candlelight, I could see his face clearly now, and it too had changed. Without the padding that had filled out his cheeks and jowls, his features were sharp and defined, handsome in a severe, aristocratic way. His jaw was firm, his cheekbones high, his nose straight and patrician. Only his eyes remained the same, those storm-gray eyes that watched me with an expression of guarded wariness. "I do not understand," I said, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, hollow and distant. "Why would you? All of this. Why?" The Duke, my husband, this stranger who was suddenly a different person entirely, let out a long breath. He ran a hand through his hair again, a gesture I would come to recognize as a sign of agitation. "It is a complicated story," he said, "and not a particularly pleasant one. I think," I replied, "that after what I have just witnessed, I am entitled to hear it." He studied me for a moment, as though weighing my words, assessing my resolve. Then he nodded slowly and gestured toward a pair of chairs set before the fire in his chamber. "Very well," he said. "Sit down, Rosalind. I will tell you everything." We sat facing each other across the low flames, the pile of discarded padding a strange monument between us. I pulled my nightdress tight around my legs against the chill and waited, watching the play of light and shadow across his now unfamiliar face. My mind was still reeling from what I had witnessed, struggling to reconcile the man before me with the image I had carried since our first meeting. He seemed uncertain how to begin, his hands clasped before him, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as though he were unaccustomed to sharing these particular words. "My name, as you know, is Percival Langdon," he began. "I am the 7th Duke of Ravensmoor, a title I inherited at the age of 22 when my father died of apoplexy. I was young, wealthy, and by all accounts not entirely unpleasant to look upon. I was also, in my foolishness, desperately in love." He paused, his gaze drifting to the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, turning them briefly gold before fading back to gray. Her name was Arabella Thornwood. She was the daughter of a baron, a woman of beauty and charm who moved through society like a swan gliding across still water. I met her at a ball during my first season after inheriting the title, and I was lost from the moment she smiled at me. She had golden hair and blue eyes and a laugh that seemed to light up every room she entered. I courted her with all the ardor of youth, wrote her poetry, sent her flowers, declared my intentions to her father with trembling hands and a heart full of hope. He fell silent again, and I waited, sensing that the story was about to take a darker turn. The fire crackled between us, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, a distant, mournful sound. She accepted my proposal. He continued at last. We were to be married in the spring. I spent the winter months planning our life together, imagining the home we would build, the family we would create. I was the happiest I had ever been. The world seemed full of promise, full of light. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The Duke's expression hardened, his jaw tightening with remembered pain. A week before the wedding, I discovered the truth. Arabella had never loved me. She had never loved anyone, I think, except herself. She had targeted me because of my wealth, my title, the power that came with the Ravensmoor name. I learned this from a letter she had written to a friend, a letter that somehow found its way into my hands. She described me in terms I will not repeat, mocked my affection for her, boasted of how easily I had been manipulated. She called me a fool, a puppet dancing on strings I could not even see. I felt a pang of something unexpected in my chest. Sympathy, perhaps, or recognition. I knew what it was to be used, to be seen as a means to an end, rather than a person worthy of love in their own right. I confronted her, the Duke continued. She did not deny it. In fact, she seemed almost proud of her deception, as though I were the fool for believing her performance. She told me that no woman could ever love me for myself, that my wealth and title were all I had to offer, and that I should be grateful any woman was willing to tolerate my presence in exchange for them. That is a terrible thing to say, I said softly. Perhaps. Or perhaps she was simply more honest than most. The Duke's voice had taken on a bitter edge, a trace of the wound that had never fully healed. In any case, I ended the engagement and retreated from society. I swore I would never again allow myself to be deceived, never again trust a woman who came to me seeking a duke's hand in marriage. And so I devised this. He gestured at the padding scattered across the floor, the elaborate disguise that had transformed him from a handsome young nobleman into a figure of ridicule and pity. A disguise, I said, understanding beginning to dawn. A test. Exactly, he confirmed. If a woman was willing to marry me believing me to be fat, believing me to be unappealing, then perhaps her motives were not entirely mercenary. Perhaps she might actually see me as more than a title and a fortune. It was a foolish hope, I know, but it was all I had. I stared at him, this man who had built an elaborate deception around himself as armor against a world that had hurt him, and I felt the last of my fear begin to melt away. He was not a monster. He was wounded. He was afraid. He was, in his own strange way, as lost as I was. You chose me, I said. Out of all the women in England, you chose a maid with nothing to offer. Why? The Duke met my gaze, and something flickered in those gray eyes, something warm and almost vulnerable. Because your father spoke of you, he said. Years ago, when we first became acquainted, before his circumstances declined. He told me of his daughter, his Rosalind, who had the kindest heart of anyone he had ever known, who read to the elderly in the village and brought food to the poor and never once complained about her own hardships. When I learned of his debt, when I learned that you had taken a position as a servant to help support him, I knew. I knew you were the one I had been searching for. And if I had been cruel, I asked, if I had proven to be as mercenary as Arabella, then I would have lived out my days alone, he replied simply. But I would have known the truth. And the truth, however painful, is always preferable to comfortable lies. We sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling softly between us. I thought about everything he had told me, about the woman who had broken his heart, and the walls he had built to protect himself. I thought about my own fears, my own assumptions, the dread that had filled me at the prospect of marrying a man I believed to be grotesque. I am sorry, I said at last, for what she did to you, for the pain you have carried all these years. The Duke shook his head. You have nothing to apologize for. If anything, I should be apologizing to you. I brought you here under false pretenses, forced you into a marriage you did not choose, allowed you to believe. He trailed off, his voice thick with something that might have been shame. You allowed me to believe I was sacrificing myself, I finished for him, when in truth, you were the one taking the risk. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw past the mask he wore, past the careful reserve and the guarded distance. I saw a man who was desperately lonely, who had armored himself against the world because the alternative was too painful to bear. What happens now? I asked. That, he said slowly, is entirely up to you. If you wish to leave, I will not stop you. The debt is forgiven regardless of your choice. Your father is safe. You owe me nothing. I considered his words, turning them over in my mind like stones in a stream. I could leave. I could walk away from this strange marriage and this stranger man and return to the life I had known. I could seek employment elsewhere, perhaps find a different path to whatever modest happiness might await me. But even as I considered it, I knew I would not go. There was something about Percival Langdon, this duke who hid himself behind padding and pretense, that called to something deep within me. He had chosen me not for my beauty, or my connections, or my wealth, but for the kindness of my heart. He had looked beyond circumstances and appearances and seen something in me worth valuing. Perhaps, I thought, I could learn to do the same. "I will stay," I said, and watched as his expression shifted from resignation to surprise, to something that looked almost like wonder. "But I have conditions." "Conditions," he repeated, a hint of humor entering his voice for the first time. The tension in the room seemed to ease slightly, like a held breath finally released. I nodded firmly. "First, you must stop wearing that ridiculous padding. If I am to be your wife, I refuse to embrace a pillow every time you enter a room." He laughed then, a genuine laugh that transformed his face, softening the severity and revealing the man beneath the mask. The sound was warm and rich, and I found myself smiling in response. "That seems reasonable," he agreed. "Second, you must actually speak to me. Tell me about your life, your interests, your hopes and fears. I will not live as a stranger in my own home." "Also reasonable," he said, nodding. "And third," I hesitated, suddenly uncertain, "you must give me time. I did not choose this marriage, not really. My heart was not mine to give. But perhaps, with patience and honesty, perhaps it might become so." The Duke leaned forward, his gray eyes intent upon my face. "I will wait as long as you need," he said softly. "A lifetime, if necessary. I have already waited 12 years to find someone worth trusting. I can wait a little longer to earn her love." The days that followed were strange and wonderful, a gradual unveiling of the man I had married. True to his word, Percival abandoned his padding entirely, appearing at breakfast the next morning in his true form. The servants, long accustomed to his deception, betrayed no surprise, though I caught Mrs. Pemberton's smile. I began to look forward to seeing him each morning, to feel a flutter of anticipation when I heard his footsteps in the corridor. I began to notice small things about him, the way he rubbed his jaw when he was thinking, the slight tilt of his head when he listened to me speak, the warmth that kindled in his eyes when I said something that amused him. I began, without intending to, without even realizing it, to fall in love with my husband. The realization came upon me one evening in late December, as we sat together in the library while a storm raged outside. The wind howled against the windows, and rain lashed the glass in sheets. But inside we were warm and safe, cocooned in the soft glow of firelight and the smell of old books. Percival was reading aloud from a volume of poetry, his deep voice lending weight and beauty to words I had read a dozen times before. I found myself watching him instead of listening, tracing the line of his jaw with my eyes, imagining what it would feel like to trace it with my fingers. His profile was sharp and clean in the firelight, his expression intent as he read, and I felt something shift in my chest, some final barrier giving way. He glanced up and caught me staring, and something passed between us, a current of electricity that made my breath catch in my throat. "Rosalind," he said, and his voice was rough, unsteady. "Is something wrong?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. But I did not look away. I held his gaze across the flickering firelight, and I saw my own feelings reflected back at me, the same wonder, the same fear, the same desperate hope. He set the book aside and rose from his chair, crossing the distance between us in 3 long strides. He knelt before me, taking my hands in his, and his touch sent warmth flooding through my veins like summer wine. "I know I promised to wait," he said. "I know I said I would give you time. But Rosalind, I find it increasingly difficult to be near you and not tell you what you have come to mean to me." I looked down at our joined hands, his fingers strong and gentle around mine. "What do I mean to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything," he replied, and the words seemed to contain whole worlds of meaning. You are everything, Rosalind. You are the light in every room, the first thought in my morning, and the last before I sleep. You have given me something I thought I would never have again, something I had given up hope of ever finding. You have given me someone to love. Tears pricked at my eyes, blurring my vision. Percival, I began, but he shook his head, silencing me. You do not have to say anything, he said. I am not asking for a response. I simply needed you to know. Whatever comes next, whatever you decide, I wanted you to know the truth of my heart. I reached up and touched his face, my fingers tracing the contours of his cheekbone, his jaw, the corner of his mouth. He closed his eyes at my touch, a tremor passing through him. The truth of my heart, I said softly, is that I love you too. His eyes flew open, filled with a hope so naked and vulnerable that it made my own heart ache. Do you mean it? He asked. Truly? I smiled, a smile that felt as though it were being pulled from somewhere deep within me, somewhere that had been locked away for years. Truly, I confirmed. I did not expect it. I did not choose it, but it happened all the same. I love you, Percival Langdon. I love the man behind the mask, the one who was brave enough to let me see him. He kissed me then, a kiss that started gentle and grew urgent, full of all the longing and restraint of the weeks we had spent circling around each other. His hands cupped my face, his fingers threading through my hair, and I felt myself melting into him, all the barriers I had built dissolving like morning mist. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. I have dreamed of this, he confessed. Every night since you arrived, I have dreamed of holding you like this, of hearing you say those words. Then dream no more, I told him. The reality is here, and it is not going anywhere. That night I did not return to my separate chambers. I stayed with Percival, in the bed that was now ours together. And in the darkness we spoke of everything and nothing, of our fears and our hopes, and the future that stretched before us like an uncharted sea. We held each other close, skin against skin, heartbeat against heartbeat, and it was enough. It was more than enough. In the days that followed, everything changed and nothing changed. The routine we had established continued, but now there was a new dimension to it, a deeper intimacy that colored every interaction. We still took breakfast together and walked the grounds and read aloud by the fire, but now there were also stolen kisses in shadowy corridors, whispered endearments across the dinner table, long nights spent discovering each other in ways both tender and passionate. Mrs. Pemberton noticed the change, of course. Nothing escaped her keen eyes. But she said nothing, merely smiled to herself and ensured that the staff gave us our privacy. The other servants followed her lead, and soon the entire household seemed to glow with the warmth of our happiness. One morning in January, I woke to find Percival already dressed, standing by the window and watching the snow fall over the estate. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, propping myself up on one elbow. He turned to look at me, and his smile was soft, almost reverent. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," he said. "A year ago, I was alone in this house, convinced I would always be alone, and now I have you." I held out my hand, and he came to me, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking my fingers in his. "We both got lucky," I said. "We both got more than we ever expected." He kissed my hand, then my wrist, then the inside of my elbow, sending shivers down my spine. "Shall we have breakfast?" he asked, his eyes dancing with mischief. "Or shall we stay here a while longer?" I pulled him down beside me, laughing. "Breakfast can wait," I said, and it did. The winter deepened around us, wrapping Ravensmoor Hall in a blanket of snow and silence. We spent the holidays together, just the two of us, in a cocoon of warmth and happiness that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Percival gave me a necklace, that had belonged to his mother, a delicate strand of pearls with a sapphire clasp, and I gave him a book of poetry I had copied out by hand during the long evenings when he was attending to estate business, each poem one that held special meaning for our growing love. On New Year's Eve, we stood together at the window of the great hall, watching fireworks burst over the distant village. Percival's arm was around my waist, my head resting against his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I was thinking about how strange life is," I replied. "A few months ago I was a maid, scrubbing floors and polishing silver, convinced I would never know love or happiness. And now—" I gestured at the vast room around us, the luxury I still had not entirely grown accustomed to. "Now I am a duchess, married to a man who makes my heart sing every time he looks at me." "And is that a good thing?" he asked, a hint of his old insecurity coloring his voice. I turned in his arms, facing him directly. "It is the best thing," I said firmly. "It is the only thing." He kissed me again as the fireworks painted the sky in colors of gold and silver, and I thought that perhaps I understood at last why stories always ended with happily ever after. Not because happiness was the end of everything, but because it was the beginning of a life shared, of adventures undertaken together, of the small daily joys that make up a marriage worth having. The spring came slowly to Ravensmoor, a gradual warming that melted the snow and coaxed green shoots from the frozen earth. Percival and I watched the transformation together, marking each small sign of renewal as though it were a miracle. One morning in early April, he came to me with a letter in his hand, his expression troubled. "What is it?" I asked, setting aside the embroidery I had been working on. "It is from London," he said, "from some of my old acquaintances. They have heard rumors that I have married, and they wish to know if it is true." I felt a flutter of unease in my stomach. "What will you tell them?" "The truth," he replied simply, "that I have married the most wonderful woman in England, and that I am happier than I have ever been." "But what about?" I hesitated, not wanting to speak of things that might cause him pain. "What about your disguise? What about the reasons you created it?" Percival was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window and the gardens beyond. "I have been thinking about that," he admitted. "For years I have hidden from the world, afraid of being hurt again, afraid of trusting anyone with my true self. But you have shown me that such fear is a prison of my own making. You have shown me that love is possible, even for someone as broken as I believed myself to be." He turned to face me, and his eyes were clear and determined. "I do not wish to hide any more," he said. "I want the world to know who I really am. I want to stand beside you in ballrooms and drawing rooms and let everyone see the truth. No more masks, no more pretense." "Are you certain?" I asked. "Society can be cruel. There will be questions, whispers." "Let them whisper," he replied, a ghost of a smile playing around his lips. "I have you by my side. What does the opinion of society matter compared to that?" I rose and went to him, taking his hands in mine. "Then let us face them together," I said. "Whatever comes, we will face it together." And so we did. Our first public appearance as the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmoor was at a ball hosted by the Earl and Countess of Westbridge, one of the few couples who had maintained correspondence with Percival during his years of seclusion. The Countess, a shrewd woman with a kind heart, had extended the invitation with what seemed like genuine warmth, and Percival had accepted it as our entry back into society. I will not pretend that I was not terrified. As our carriage rolled through the streets of London, I pressed my gloved hands together to stop them from trembling. I was a maid, I was nobody, and I was about to walk into a room full of aristocrats and pretend I belonged among them. Percival seemed to sense my fear. He reached across the carriage and took my hand, his thumb stroking gentle circles against my palm. "Remember," he said quietly, "you are not an imposter. You are my wife, my duchess, and you have more worth in your smallest finger than most of those people have in their entire beings. I managed a weak smile. You have to say that. You are married to me. I have to say it because it is true, he corrected. I married you because of who you are, Rosalind. Do not ever forget that. The ball was everything I had imagined and feared. A vast ballroom glittering with candlelight. Crowds of elegantly dressed men and women, the strains of orchestral music floating through the perfumed air. Heads turned as we entered, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. I knew what they were seeing. The Duke of Ravensmoor, mysterious and reclusive, finally emerged from his self-imposed exile. And on his arm, a woman no one recognized, a woman with no title, no fortune, no family connections worth mentioning. I lifted my chin and walked forward with my husband, determined not to let them see my fear. The Earl and Countess of Westbridge greeted us warmly, and the Countess was particularly effusive in her welcome. "My dear Duchess," she said, taking both my hands in hers, "I have heard so much about you. The Duke has been writing such glowing letters that I half suspected he had invented you entirely. But here you are, quite real and quite lovely." "Thank you, my lady," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "You are very kind." "Not at all." She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "And between us, it does my heart good to see Percival so happy. He has been alone far too long." As the evening progressed, I found that the Countess was not the only one who extended kindness. Many of the guests seemed genuinely curious about me, asking polite questions about my background and my impressions of Ravensmoor Hall. A few were cooler, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes, but even they maintained a veneer of civility. And through it all, Percival remained by my side. He introduced me to old friends and new acquaintances, deflected intrusive questions with practiced ease, and never once allowed me to feel alone or overwhelmed. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, he led me onto the dance floor and held me close, his hand warm against my back. "You are doing wonderfully," he murmured in my ear as we moved through the steps. "I am trying not to step on your feet," I confessed. He laughed softly. "You are succeeding admirably. But that is not what I meant. You are winning them over, Rosalind. Every single one of them." I glanced around the ballroom at the watching faces, and I realized he was right. There were smiles now, where there had been suspicious stares. There was curiosity that bordered on admiration. Whatever judgment they had been prepared to render, it seemed I had passed some unspoken test. It was later in the evening, as I was taking a moment to catch my breath near a window, that I encountered her. She was beautiful, with golden hair and porcelain skin, and eyes the color of a summer sky. She approached me with a smile that did not quite conceal the sharpness beneath. "So you are the new Duchess of Ravensmoor," she said, her voice carrying a honeyed poison. I must confess, when I heard Percival had finally married, I was consumed with curiosity. "You know my husband?" I asked, though something in her tone made me wary. "Oh, yes." Her smile widened, revealing teeth that looked almost predatory. "We were engaged once, you know, before he developed his peculiar habits." My heart clenched. "Arabella. Arabella Thornwood," she confirmed, as though she had been waiting for the recognition. "Though I am Mrs. Crawford now, I married a viscount shortly after my engagement to Percival ended." She gave a slight, elegant shrug. One must move on, after all. I studied her, this woman who had wounded my husband so deeply, who had mocked his love and broken his heart. She was everything I was not, polished and poised and dripping with aristocratic breeding. And yet looking at her now, I felt not intimidation, but something closer to pity. "I am sorry," I said quietly. "I do not mean to be rude, but was there something you wished to say to me?" Arabella's expression flickered, surprise breaking through the careful mask. "I merely wanted to offer my congratulations," she said, "and perhaps a word of advice. And what advice would that be? She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Do not expect too much from him. Percival has always been difficult, cold. I fear you may find that his affection cools quickly once the novelty wears off. I met her gaze steadily. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I think perhaps you did not know him as well as you believed. Before she could respond, I felt a hand on my elbow. Percival had appeared beside me, his expression unreadable. Arabella, he said coolly. It has been a long time. Percival. Her composure had returned, the predatory smile back in place. I was just getting acquainted with your charming new wife. So I see. He looked at me, and his eyes softened. I hope she has not been troubling you, my dear. Not at all, I replied. We were simply discussing how fortunate I am to have married such a wonderful man. Arabella's smile faltered. Yes, she said. Quite fortunate indeed. If you will excuse me. She swept away, her silk gown rustling with indignation. Percival watched her go, his expression thoughtful. I am sorry, he said. I should have warned you she might be here. There is nothing to apologize for. I slipped my hand into his. She is part of your past. I am your present and your future. That is all that matters. He lifted my hand to his lips and kissed it, right there in the middle of the ballroom, with half of London society watching. I love you, he said softly. Have I told you that recently? Not in the last hour, I replied, smiling. I was beginning to wonder if your affection had cooled. He laughed and pulled me back onto the dance floor for another waltz. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of music and laughter. I danced with Percival again and again, and when we were not dancing, we circulated through the room together, accepting congratulations and answering questions with the practiced ease of a couple who had been together for years rather than months. By the time we departed, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. In the carriage on the way home, I leaned against Percival's shoulder, exhausted but exhilarated. That went well, I said, stifling a yawn. Better than well, he replied, his arm around me. You were magnificent, Rosalind. I could not have asked for a better partner. I smiled against his coat. Even when Arabella tried to intimidate me, especially then, the way you handled her. He shook his head in admiration. I spent years running from that woman and the wound she inflicted. And you faced her down without so much as a tremor. She is not worth fearing, I said simply. She is a bitter, unhappy person who tried to make you feel small because that is the only way she can feel powerful. But she has no power over us, not anymore. Percival pressed a kiss to the top of my head. No, he agreed, she does not. The London season continued, and with each passing week, our place in society grew more secure. The invitations that arrived at our townhouse multiplied, and the whispers that had once followed us through ballrooms faded into acceptance. We were no longer a curiosity to be discussed. We were simply the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmoor, a couple whose obvious affection for each other had become almost legendary. But as much as I enjoyed our time in London, my heart belonged to Ravensmoor Hall. There was something about that ancient house that called to me, something in its stone walls and wild gardens that felt like home in a way no other place ever had. And so, as summer approached, we bid farewell to the city and returned to the north. The estate was transformed by the season. The moors that had seemed so bleak in November now blazed with purple heather and golden gorse. The garden surrounding the house burst with roses and honeysuckle, their sweet scent drifting through open windows on the warm breeze. The lake sparkled in the sunlight, and the ancient oak tree where Percival had played as a child was thick with green leaves. I spent my days exploring every corner of the estate, learning its secrets and its stories. The servants had accepted me fully now, and they delighted in sharing their knowledge of the place. Mrs. Pemberton told me about the ghost that supposedly haunted the East Wing, though she admitted she had never seen it herself. The head gardener showed me the rare orchids in the greenhouse that had been collected by Percival's grandmother. The stablemaster introduced me to each of the horses by name and told me stories of their individual temperaments. And through it all, Percival was by my side. He showed me the hidden passages that ran through the old walls, the secret room behind the library where treasure had supposedly been hidden during the Civil Wars, the spot on the roof where one could see 3 counties on a clear day. He shared his home with me as he had shared his heart, holding nothing back, trusting me with everything he was. The months that followed were the happiest of my life. We divided our time between Ravensmoor Hall and a townhouse in London, gradually building a social circle of friends who valued us for who we were rather than what we represented. The Tun, that fickle creature of collective opinion, eventually grew bored of speculating about the mysterious new Duchess and accepted me as one of their own. There were more balls, more dinners, more afternoons spent in drawing rooms, exchanging pleasantries with ladies whose names I struggled to remember. But with Percival by my side, nothing seemed insurmountable. He had a gift for putting people at ease, for steering conversations away from uncomfortable topics, for making even the most skeptical observer believe that our marriage was exactly what it appeared to be, a love match. And it was. Every day, I fell more deeply in love with my husband. I loved the way he rose early each morning to ride across the estate, returning with windswept hair and color in his cheeks. I loved the way he debated politics with his friends, passionate but always fair, always willing to consider another point of view. I loved the way he looked at me across crowded rooms, as though I were the only person in the world worth seeing. I loved the small things, too. The way he brought me wildflowers he had picked on his rides, presenting them with a theatrical bow that made me laugh. The way he remembered every detail of the stories I told him, recalling months later some trivial thing I had mentioned in passing. The way he held me at night, his arms wrapped around me as though he feared I might vanish if he let go. One evening, in late May, we hosted a dinner party at our London townhouse. It was a small gathering, just a dozen guests who had become genuine friends over the past months. The Countess of Westbridge was there, along with her husband and several others whose company we had come to enjoy. The conversation turned, as it often did, to gossip. Someone mentioned a scandal involving a minor baronet, and the Countess rolled her eyes. "Really," she said, "you would think people would find better things to do with their time than ruin each other's reputations." "Speaking of reputations," her husband said, leaning forward with a gleam of mischief in his eye, "I heard an interesting rumor the other day. About our host, in fact." I felt Percival stiffen slightly beside me, but his expression remained pleasant. "Oh?" he said lightly. "Do tell." The Earl grinned. "Apparently, there are those who claim that your years of seclusion were all a ruse, that you were never really well, as you appeared to be, that it was all some sort of elaborate disguise." A hush fell over the table. I held my breath, waiting to see how Percival would respond. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. For 12 years, he had maintained his deception. For 12 years, he had hidden his true self from the world. And now, here was the moment of truth. Then he laughed, a genuine, full-throated laugh that broke the tension like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I suppose there is no point in denying it," he said. "The rumor is true. I wore padding for years, presenting myself as a man twice my actual size. It was a test of sorts, a way of determining which women might be interested in me for my own sake rather than for my title and fortune." The guests stared at him in astonishment. Even those who had heard whispers seemed surprised by his candid admission. "And it worked," Percival continued, reaching over to take my hand. "It brought me the most extraordinary woman in the world, a woman who agreed to marry what she believed was a grotesque stranger, solely to save her father from ruin. A woman whose courage and kindness have transformed my life beyond measure." He lifted my hand to his lips and kissed it, his eyes never leaving mine. "Whatever judgment the world may render," he said, I regret nothing. Every moment of discomfort, every year of loneliness was worth it, because it led me to her. The silence stretched for another moment. Then the Countess began to clap, and one by one the other guests joined in. There were tears in some eyes and smiles on every face. "Well," the Earl said finally, raising his glass, "to the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmoor, may their love story inspire us all." "To the Duke and Duchess," the guests echoed, and the warmth of their goodwill wrapped around me like a blanket. After the guests had departed, Percival and I stood together in the drawing room, the candles burning low around us. "That was very brave," I said softly, "telling them the truth." He shrugged, though I could see the relief in his eyes. "I am tired of hiding. I am tired of secrets and pretense. You have shown me that there is nothing to fear from being seen as I truly am." I reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "And what you truly are," I said, "is the man I love more than anything in the world." He kissed me then, a kiss full of promise and possibility, and I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. We visited my father often, bringing him gifts and stories of our adventures. He had been moved to a comfortable cottage on the Ravensmoor estate, close enough to visit frequently, but far enough to maintain his independence. The change in him was remarkable. Free from the burden of debt and worry, he began to resemble the man I remembered from my childhood, gentle and kind, with a spark of humor in his eyes that I had thought